Standing Committees on the Codes and Health and the Standing Committee on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse. I thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I was able to provide this morning just some copies of my testimony. I'm going to actually make it shorter than I anticipated because a lot of the good data, statistics on how people of color are affected in New York State were cited throughout the day. Very recently, during the last panel from our colleagues at the Legal Aid Society. My name is Juan Cartagena. I'm the President General Counsel of Latino Justice PearlDEF. Many of you may recall the organization being the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. We are a 45-year-old civil rights institution in the Latino community. We've been headquartered here in New York City since the moment we opened our doors. We now have offices outside of New York State as well. And I wanted to share the views of marijuana legalization and its benefits for communities of color, particularly for Latinos, the state's largest racial and ethnic minority. Some of the few points that I just wanted to do, because of written testimony that give you cites to a number of sources that make the foundation of the statistical evidence I wanted to share with you. So I'm just going to really make two basic points. The first one, of course, in my opinion, is that marijuana, and the goal of my testimony is to elaborate how marijuana legalization is a civil rights issue in the Latino and African-American community writ large. And to get to that point, I would say that marijuana, any reform legislation must eliminate completely the racially skewed practice of law enforcement penalties on possession, consumption of marijuana. Complete legalization for recreational use will go a long way to solving that disparity. A long way. Like any legislation, should it be passed by the state of New York, will have to be monitored as well for racially skewed outcomes. But at least in theory, it should definitely go a long way to solving the problem of the issue of racially skewed law enforcement practices. I will skip over the national statistics because they were cited before, the New York State statistics about how many people get arrested daily, and really on page 2 at the very top, really focus on one aspect of the most recent data regarding marijuana arrests in New York City from the report issued by both the Drug Policy Alliance and the Marijuana Reform Project, the report by Harry Levine. And there, the report itemized all the arrests from 1987 through 2016. Over 738,000 arrests were made with the following demographic profile of all those arrests cumulatively from 1987 to 2016. 11% white, 53% black, 33% Latino. The highest all-time rates of possessions for whites in all those years, all-time rates, that is, of all the people arrested in a particular year, how many were white, was never really more than a fifth of the entire volume. 23% was the highest for whites ever in any one particular year in that long span of time. Whereas for blacks, the record rates were exceeded 3/5 of the share many times and once reached as high as 63%. That means that in one particular year, blacks were 63% of all arrested in New York City for possession alone. For Latinos, the highest rates hover just under 2/5. That means just under 40%, in the range of 37 to 39%. But my point to this is that the highest all-time rates for Latinos arrested in any one particular year in New York City have been matched or exceeded only in the last 3 years. That means only during the de Blasio administration. So the issue of marijuana arrests in New York City, while the total number of arrests have gone down, and that's at a very important point, an attribute to how policy has changed in New York City, the fact of the matter is the Latino arrests are very, very high proportionally, and especially so in the last 3 years. As a result, the issue of skewed law enforcement is still a prevalent issue. And then my second and last point is that marijuana reform legislation cannot be allowed to pass without restorative justice elements being at the forefront of any kind of change. Reform cannot just be prospective only, not with the backdrop of decades of selective and racially discriminatory marijuana arrests and their effects on communities of color. Latinos and blacks have been directly harmed by law enforcement schemes that have been largely ignored by all institutions of government, even when it knew that marijuana possession, consumption, and sales were prevalent in corresponding white communities. To that end, Latino Justice, we urge the New York State Assembly to consider at a minimum the following measures. Sealing of past convictions for crimes that may be eliminated in a legalization scheme is critical for the restoration of the harms caused by the current broken scheme. The new marijuana industry is going to be a booming economic engine that creates jobs, and at the same time, those jobs are scarce in general in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Those who have been part of the illicit market must be able to enter the new regulated market. So a prior conviction for possession, possession for sale, manufacturing, transportation, or cultivation of any controlled substance should not be the basis for a loan for the denial of a license in a new regulated marijuana market. Currently, New York's medical marijuana regulatory schemes contain punitive measures against persons previously convicted for possession. They cannot work, or let alone own a dispensary, and that should not be repeated. Possession of marijuana has serious consequences for Latino non-citizen immigrants, as you've heard today from our colleagues at Legal Aid, and that risks deportation. So the reform legislation must be allowed to have those records for marijuana offenses and direct appeals vacated and sealed. Legislation must also address parole and probation violations for persons currently under criminal supervision. It must eliminate failed marijuana drug tests for justification for violation of parole or probation. This would also ensure prison populations are reduced. Portions of the revenue from the proceeds of legalized marijuana market must be reinvestment in communities of color via adult education, job training, after-school programs. These investments will create opportunities in the same communities disproportionately harmed. And lastly, a new market, of course, should support diversity in ownership and participation with concrete plans to ensure licensure targets minority-owned and women-owned businesses. I'll end with this to all of you, and I really do appreciate the fact that you've been taking this on in New York State. But it should not be lost on your consideration that the word marijuana is a Spanish word. That when this entire prohibitionist paradigm was created in the 20s and 30s, led in large part by a drug czar named Anslinger, that the direct, among many populations that were being targeted, Latinos were being targeted as well. That the first jurisdiction to pass a prohibitionist paradigm in the United States, from what I've read in the reports, is El Paso, Texas. That it was the people who were using marijuana, in large part Mexicans, that were being targeted, not so much the nature of the plant itself. That is why this issue of marijuana legalization is so important to Latino communities throughout New York State and New York City. I dare say it's why it is extremely important for Latinos throughout the country as well. Thank you very much.
Questions? Yep. Yep.
Thank you, sir, for your comments.
Sure. Thank you.
You said marijuana is a Spanish word?
Mm-hmm.
Did you say it was a Spanish word?
Yes, I sure did.
Ah.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean?
It means the plant.
The plant.
It's actually the name of the plant. It was called marijuana, Guana, in Mexico. A lot of the literature that I've read and recognized that marijuana crossed, well, it's hard to say it crossed the border when the border crossed the people, right? The border crossed the people in southwest U.S. and the western part of the U.S. But the plant was used for medicinal purposes throughout decades and decades and decades of life. It was found in what we call botanicas, which are basically like small bodegas with a portion that actually sells medicine, or medicine that over the counter. So it was used for medicinal purposes throughout many parts. And as a result, after the Mexican Revolution, when there's a larger migration of Mexicanos into what we now call the United States, it came with them. It's not the only time it existed in the United States, but it's probably the time in which the government, in order to, again, address the issue of Mexican migration, in this case, and broader Latino migration, addressed what they were using and targeted them for penalization and prohibition.
Interesting. So you said around what year was that?
That would have been in
first
the
happened?
20s, 30s, 20s?
20s?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Thank you
Thank you.
for sharing.
Any other? Yeah.
Let me ask you a question about, we heard testimony earlier about this marijuana buyers club and the potential of legalizing that. What is your thinking about that approach?
I was, on behalf of Latino Justice, we would support all legalization efforts. The fact that some individuals need it for medical reasons is an even better reason to legalize it in general. But even if the legalization just resulted in recreational use, that would be ideal. It takes away all the skewed racially enforcement issues that I just raised, and it also provides for a broader or accessibility to people who need it for medicinal purposes. So by all means, I would definitely support it.
Thank you.
Thank you.